The first thing my mother saw was the helicopter. She was sitting in the back seat of my father's black sedan, outside the locked gate of Aunt Mary's vineyard, holding Samantha's phone between both hands. The ceremony was streaming live on the screen. My family had refused the invitations I sent them. They had called the national broadcast vulgar. They had accused me of turning my wedding into revenge. They had missed the response deadline and returned the invitation with a sentence written across the front in my mother's handwriting. "We will not participate in your spectacle." Now they were outside the vineyard, demanding to be admitted before the cameras noticed their absence. On Samantha's phone, hundreds of guests rose from wooden chairs beneath an old oak tree. Wildflowers lined the aisle. Children from community art programs carried painted banners, while a string quartet played beside the lavender garden. It was the same backyard my mother had once called a pity party in the dirt. The helicopter descended over the lower field, bending the grass beneath its blades. The broadcast camera followed it until the door opened and Damian Cole stepped onto the vineyard. The announcer identified him as the chairman and chief executive of Cole Meridian Holdings, a global company valued at more than $12 billion and one of the wealthiest self-made executives in the country, with a personal fortune estimated above $5 billion. But Damien did not look toward the cameras. He looked toward the house where I was waiting in my wedding dress. My phone vibrated inside the hidden pocket of my skirt. My father had written, "We're at the gate. Tell security to let us in." Then my mother, "Do not embarrass this family on national television." Finally, Samantha, you planned all this to make us look cruel. For most of my life, I would have answered immediately. I had been trained to treat their anger as authority and their disappointment as proof that I had failed. That afternoon, I read the messages without trembling. I typed 5 words. Too late. Much too late. Then I turned off my phone and walked toward the life I had built after they tried to convince me I deserved nothing. But the helicopter was not where my story began. It began nearly 3 years earlier, when my mother laughed at the first wedding I tried to plan. My name is Ellie Monroe. At 28, I taught children's art classes 3 afternoons a week and spent the rest of my time trying to build a career as a painter. I rented a small apartment above a bakery outside Sacramento, drove a second-hand car that rattled whenever I turned left, and knew exactly how many paintings I needed to sell each month to pay rent without touching my grocery money. My life was not impressive by my family's standards. It was mine, which mattered more. I had loved painting since childhood, because paint did not compare me to anyone. Blue did not become less beautiful because red entered the room. A canvas never accused me of being dramatic when I admitted something hurt. If I made a mistake, I could step back, study it, and decide whether to cover it or make it part of the picture. My family never offered that kind of mercy. My older sister, Samantha, had been the center of our household for as long as I could remember. She was beautiful in a way people recognized immediately. Tall, polished, graceful, and skilled at making strangers believe they had been waiting all evening to meet her. As a child, she entered pageants. As a teenager, she became class president. In college, she joined the right organizations and learned how to turn every social event into evidence of her importance. My mother displayed Samantha's achievements throughout the house. There was Samantha wearing a silver crown at 10, Samantha holding a debate trophy at 16, Samantha in her graduation gown, Samantha shaking hands with a mayor, Samantha beside a charity banner, smiling as if she had personally rescued everyone the charity served. There was one photograph of me. It hung in the upstairs hallway near the linen closet. I was 11 years old, holding a painting that had won a county competition. Years later, my mother turned the frame slightly toward the wall so there would be room for a larger portrait of Samantha. That small movement explained my childhood more accurately than any argument could. Samantha was not the scenic cruel every day. That would have been easier to identify. Sometimes she praised me in front of other people, but in ways that reminded everyone I was beneath her. "Ellie is the creative one," she would say. "She doesn't care about practical things." Or, "I admire how little she needs to be happy." If I objected, she looked wounded. "I was complimenting you." My mother always defended her. You search for insults because attention makes you uncomfortable. My father rarely joined the criticism, but he rarely stopped it. He owned a regional construction supply company and believed every conflict could be managed by remaining calm until the more emotional person became exhausted. In our house, that person was usually me. When Samantha wanted to attend an expensive leadership program, my parents paid immediately. When I was accepted into a summer arts workshop, my mother said creative people needed to learn that wanting something did not make it financially sensible. Aunt Mary paid the fee. Mary was my father's older sister, and the only adult in my childhood who never treated my imagination like a defect. She lived at the edge of a small vineyard, in an old farmhouse, surrounded by lavender, roses, peach trees, and an enormous oak whose branches shaded most of the garden. She had once worked as a muralist and art teacher. Arthritis had slowed her hands, but she still kept jars of brushes in her studio and wore shirts marked with paint. At her house, I was never the sensitive one. I was Ellie. When I became engaged to Chris Bennett, I believed I had finally found a person who saw me the way Mary did. Chris taught history at a public middle school. He was thoughtful, patient, and modest to the point of awkwardness. He proposed beneath a park lamp on a rainy Thursday evening, his glasses fogging as he tried to keep the ring box dry. "I don't have a dramatic speech," he said. "I only know that every ordinary day is better when I come home to you." Inside the box was a slender silver ring set with a small blue sapphire. It was not expensive. It looked like a piece of sky. "Yes," I said, before he finished asking. When we told my family, Samantha took my hand and examined the ring beneath the dining room light. "Is that glass?" "It's a sapphire. A very private sapphire." Chris smiled politely. My mother did not. "He is a teacher, Ellie. Have you considered what that means for your future?" "It means I'll be married to a good man. It means money will always be a concern. We both work. Painting children's bedrooms and teaching crafts is not a career." "I don't paint bedrooms. You know what I mean." I did. She meant that nothing I built would count until someone she respected gave it a title. Chris reached beneath the table and squeezed my hand. "We wanted a small wedding." I had never dreamed of a hotel ballroom or a cathedral filled with strangers. I wanted lanterns, wildflowers, handmade signs, good food, and people who genuinely wanted to witness our marriage. Aunt Mary offered the vineyard. The moment she said it, I saw the entire ceremony. Wooden chairs beneath the oak, long tables beside the lavender, candles glowing inside jars painted by my students. A simple arbor facing the sunset. Mary showed me an electrical line near the barn that could support music equipment. She also mentioned that a documentary crew had once filmed at the vineyard and reinforced the lower field so emergency aircraft could land if necessary. I barely listened to that part. At the time, I cared more about where we would place the cake. That evening, I drew the wedding layout in my sketchbook. For the first time in weeks, I felt excited enough to call my mother. I told my family at Sunday dinner. "A backyard wedding?" my mother repeated. "At Aunt Mary's vineyard." Samantha exchanged a look with her fiancé, Charles. My mother began laughing. It was not the surprised laugh of someone who had misunderstood. It was the sharp, delighted sound she made when another person confirmed her worst opinion of them. "Ellie, that is not a wedding. That is a pity party in dirt." "It won't be in dirt. There are insects outside," Samantha said. "There is also air." Charles lowered his face, hiding a smile. Samantha noticed. My mother set down her fork. "Your sister's engagement celebration will take place on a private yacht. There will be a chef, a string quartet, and guests who could actually help your father's business. Imagine how it will look when one daughter is celebrated properly, while the other asks relatives to sit on folding chairs beside a vegetable garden. It will look like we chose different events. No. It will look like we failed to raise you with standards." Chris spoke before I could. "I think the vineyard sounds beautiful." My mother's eyes moved toward him. "That is because you do not understand what our family represents." Chris's fingers tightened around mine. "I understand what Ellie represents." For several seconds, no one spoke. It was the first time someone outside Aunt Mary had challenged my mother for me. On the drive home, I watched streetlights slide across the windshield. "You didn't have to defend me," I said. Yes, I did. They'll remember it. Let them. They can make things difficult. He glanced at me. Whatever happens, I'm not leaving. I wanted to believe that a promise made in a quiet car could be stronger than the voices that had shaped both of us. A week later, a cousin accidentally forwarded me the guest information for Samantha's yacht celebration. My parents had invited nearly every relative, family friend, and business acquaintance we knew. My name was not on the list. At first, I assumed it was an oversight. I called my mother. It wasn't a mistake, she said. She's my sister. This is an important event. You would not be comfortable. You mean Samantha would not be comfortable? My mother sighed. You have a way of making gatherings awkward. You become quiet. People notice. Then everyone feels obligated to entertain you. I wouldn't need to be entertained. Support your sister in your own way. She ended the call without saying goodbye. That evening, photographs from the yacht appeared online. Samantha stood in a silver dress, raising a glass while my parents smiled beside her. One relative wrote, "The Monroes certainly know how to celebrate a daughter properly." Another commented, "No folding chairs for this bride." Someone had told them about my wedding plans. My ceremony had become a joke before I mailed a single invitation. I went to Aunt Mary's house and found her cutting lavender near the garden path. She looked at my face and put down the clippers. "They invited everyone except me," I said. Mary did not tell me they meant well. She did not ask me to forgive them for my own peace. She opened her arms. I cried against her paint-stained shirt until I felt embarrassed by how much I still wanted my family to choose me. When I finally stepped back, Mary wiped my cheeks. "They have spent your whole life teaching you that exclusion proves you are unworthy," she said. "It doesn't. Sometimes exclusion is simply the door cruel people close before you learn to stop knocking." I looked toward the oak tree. "I still want the wedding here. Then we will make it beautiful." We walked through the garden, planning the ceremony as the sun disappeared behind the vineyard. Before I left, Mary gave me an old brass key. "The studio," she said. "Use it whenever you need somewhere quiet." I closed my fingers around it. I believed being excluded from the yacht was the worst thing my family could do before my wedding. I had no idea they had only begun. Several days after the yacht celebration, my mother asked me to come to the house. Her voice was unusually calm, which should have warned me. When I arrived, she led me upstairs. A white garment bag lay across the guest room bed. "I solved your dress problem," she announced. "I don't have a dress problem." She unzipped the bag. Layers of ivory satin, lace, and stiff tulle spilled across the quilt. I recognized the gown. Samantha had chosen it during a brief engagement several years earlier. The relationship ended before the wedding. After weeks of rumors and arguments my parents refused to discuss. The dress had remained in storage ever since. My mother lifted the sleeves. "It was extremely expensive. With a few alterations, it will be suitable for your ceremony." "You want me to wear Samantha's unused wedding dress? There is no reason to waste money on another. I'm paying for my own dress." "With what? Paintings?" "Yes." Her mouth tightened. "You should be grateful." That word had followed me through childhood. Grateful for Samantha's discarded clothing. Grateful when my parents paid the minimum required and called it generosity. Grateful whenever they offered me something only after ensuring I understood it had never been chosen for me. "No." My mother blinked. "What did you say?" "I will not wear it. Do not be childish. I am not walking into my marriage wearing something Samantha rejected. It is a designer gown. It is still not mine. You are refusing an opportunity most women would appreciate. I am refusing another reminder that I am expected to live from whatever remains after Samantha is satisfied." For once, my mother had no immediate response. Her surprise revealed something important. She had never believed I might truly say no. I left the gown on the bed. The following Sunday, my parents summoned Chris and me to dinner. When we arrived, printed schedules, vendor lists, and seating charts were arranged across the table. Samantha and Charles sat together at one end. My mother gestured toward the empty chairs. "We have found a solution that benefits everyone." Chris looked at me. "What solution?" I asked. "We will combine the weddings." I thought I had misunderstood. Samantha folded her hands. "The yacht can host another short ceremony before ours. my mother continued. You and Chris can exchange vows first. The guests will remain for Samantha's celebration. You want my wedding to be the opening act at hers. Do not phrase it that way. How should I phrase it? As an opportunity. Samantha smiled. Honestly, Ellie, you should be relieved. This way people will actually attend. Chris sat very still. My wedding will be at Aunt Mary's, I said. My father spoke. Your mother is offering to save you considerable expense. She is offering to erase me. Everything is not an attack. No. Sometimes it is control. My mother placed both palms on the table. If you refuse, we will not contribute financially. We will not contact vendors. We will not encourage relatives to attend. You will manage everything alone. I looked at the schedules. Samantha's name appeared in large script on every page. Mine did not appear once. I am already alone. Chris touched my arm. We should go. Samantha leaned back. You always loved playing the victim. I turned toward her. Like I did when Daniel started calling you while he was still dating me. Her expression shifted. Daniel had been my boyfriend several years earlier. He ended our relationship suddenly, offering no reason beyond saying he felt confused. I later learned that Samantha had encouraged him to confide in her. Nothing serious ever developed between them. She lost interest as soon as he became available. The incident was not the greatest betrayal of my life. What mattered was that my family had known. My mother looked down at the table. You knew, I said. She sighed. Daniel was better suited to Samantha socially. You let me believe something was wrong with me. You needed to learn that relationships end. Samantha rolled her eyes. It happened years ago. You did not even want him. That is not the point. No, I said. The point was proving you could take something from me. For a second, pain flickered behind her polished expression. Then it disappeared. You always think everything is about you. My father stood. That is enough. I removed the house key my parents had given me in college and placed it beside the schedules. My mother stared at it. What is that supposed to mean? It means you can stop arranging tests for me. I am no longer participating. I walked out. In the car, Chris remained quiet. What are you thinking? I asked. That this is worse than I understood. They have always been like this. I know, but knowing from stories is different from sitting in the room. You said you wouldn't leave. I'm not leaving. He reached for my hand. I believed him. Several days later, my mother called Chris directly. He did not tell me until I saw her name appear on his phone while we were choosing catering options. Why is my mother calling you? He turned the screen face down. She wants to discuss the wedding. Without me? She thinks you are too emotional to have a productive conversation. And you answered? Only twice. Twice? He rubbed the back of his neck. She knows people connected to the school district. Your father serves on a fundraising board with 2 trustees. My stomach tightened. What does that have to do with us? There is a curriculum coordinator position opening. You applied for it? I mentioned months ago that I might. What did she offer? She did not offer anything. What did she imply? He hesitated. That the trustees would consider me more favorably if the family situation became less difficult. Meaning if we postponed our wedding. She did not say it directly. She never does. Chris leaned forward. The position would nearly double my salary. It would mean stability. My mother calls obedience stability. That is not fair. No. What she is doing is not fair. He stood and began pacing. I am trying to think about our future. Our future or your promotion. Those are not separate things. They become separate when my family makes one dependent on controlling me. He stopped. I haven't agreed to anything. But you did not tell me. I knew you would react like this. The sentence sounded so much like my mother that I felt physically cold. He apologized immediately. But something had shifted. During the next month, Chris began changing. He missed a vendor meeting. He suggested reducing the guest list. Then he proposed moving the date until after Samantha's wedding so the family could settle down. My mother told relatives that our plans were uncertain. Several guests declined without explanation. When I confronted her, she sounded almost pleased. You should speak to your fiancé. What have you done? I encouraged him to think seriously about marrying into conflict. You created the conflict. Your refusal to compromise created it. That evening, I asked Chris to meet me at the vineyard. The arbor had been built beneath the oak. Empty wooden chairs waited near the barn for the ceremony. Chris walked toward me slowly. I received the job offer, he said. The district position? Yes. And what do they expect? No one wrote down a condition. That is not an answer. He looked toward the rows of vines. Your father spoke to one of the trustees. Did you accept? I asked for time. How much? A week. Our wedding is in less than 2 months. I know. Do you still want to marry me? He looked at me. I love you. That was not the question. His silence lasted only a few seconds. It was long enough. I removed the sapphire ring. He stepped closer. Ellie, don't. I am not ending anything. I am asking you to choose whether you are standing beside me. I need time. I closed my fingers around the ring. For the first time, I understood that someone could hold your hand while slowly stepping away. 3 days later, Chris asked me to meet him beneath the park lamp where he had proposed. It was raining again. Before he spoke, I saw that he had already chosen. Chris stood beneath the park lamp with his hands inside his coat pockets. I am sorry, he said. Rain gathered on his glasses. For what? He looked down. I can't do this. Do what? Marry into a family that hates me. They do not hate you. They think I am beneath them. They think I am beneath them too. That does not make it easier. No, I said. It doesn't. He finally looked at me. Every day is another fight. Your mother calls. Samantha sends messages. Your father speaks to district trustees. I teach all day and spend every evening waiting for a new crisis. So, you are leaving because loving me became inconvenient. That is not what I said. It is what you mean. He took a breath. I care about you, Ellie, but I don't think caring is enough. I opened my hand and showed him the ring. Did you accept the position? He hesitated. Yes. That answer hurt more than the breakup. Not because he wanted a better job. I could have celebrated ambition. It hurt because the opportunity had been attached to my surrender, and he had accepted it while pretending no decision had been made. I placed the ring in his palm. I hope the position is worth it. Ellie, you do not get to ask me to make this easier for you. I walked away before I started crying. During the following weeks, I moved through my life as though someone had lowered the volume on the world. I canceled vendors, returned decorations, contacted guests, lost deposits I could not afford to lose. My parents never called. Samantha posted photographs from a bridal fitting with the caption, "Some weddings are meant to happen." I stopped looking at social media. The date that should have been my wedding arrived beneath a clear spring sky. Aunt Mary suggested we spend the afternoon at the vineyard instead of hiding from it. Several supplies and floral deposits were non-refundable, so she invited my students and their parents. We turned the flowers into arrangements for a nursing home. The children painted the unused wooden signs. Someone brought lemonade. Mary played old records through an open studio window. For several hours, the day felt like something other than a funeral. Then one parent received a notification. Samantha's engagement celebration had been rescheduled for that afternoon. The yacht was filled with relatives who had once promised to attend my wedding. Photographs showed my mother raising a champagne glass beneath a banner that read, "To the celebration our family deserves." I stared at the image. Mary took the phone from my hand. "Do not give them the rest of today. They took the whole day." "No, they occupied a few hours. The rest is still yours." But by sunset, the strength I had borrowed from her was gone. I walked beneath the oak and looked at the unfinished arbor. The chairs had been returned. The lanterns remained boxed in the barn. For months, I had defended that garden, insisting it could hold something beautiful. Now it felt like evidence that my family had been right about me. I should have listened, I whispered. Mary stood beside me. To whom? My mother, Samantha, Chris. Maybe this was embarrassing. Maybe I keep choosing things that cannot survive. Mary turned me toward her. Chris did not leave because your wedding was small. He left because his courage was. Tears filled my eyes. I am tired of being the lesson everyone learns before they choose a better life. Then stop volunteering for the role. I do not know how. Yes, you do. She took the brass studio key from the chain around my neck. Come with me. Mary's studio had been mostly closed for years. Arthritis had made fine brushwork painful, although she still taught occasionally. At the back of the room was a locked storage space I had never entered. Mary opened it. Inside were canvases, easels, frames, boxes of supplies, and dozens of paintings from my childhood. I stared. "You kept these?" "Every one you tried to throw away." There was a blue horse I painted at 9, a view of Mary's garden from when I was 13, a self-portrait from high school in which I had painted my mouth as a locked door. At the back stood a large canvas covered by cloth. Mary removed it. It was a painting I had begun at 17 and abandoned after my mother called it self-indulgent. The image showed a woman walking through a dark house while carrying a bowl of light. "It is unfinished," I said. "So were you." I touched the dried edge of the canvas. "Why did you keep it?" "Because abandoning a painting does not mean it has nothing left to say." I sat on an old stool. "My future is gone. One future is gone. It was the one I planned." "Plans are drawings, Ellie. Life is the building. Sometimes the structure changes. I have nowhere to go. You have a room here. I am almost 30. And I am almost 70. We can disappoint society together." I laughed through my tears. 2 weeks later, I moved out of my apartment. I told myself it was temporary. Mary gave me the guest room overlooking the vineyard, half a hall closet, and a shelf in the kitchen. I stored my remaining wedding boxes in the barn and avoided opening them. For the first month, I taught classes and slept. I began paintings, hated them, and scraped the canvases blank. I avoided parks, wedding announcements, and streets near my parents' house. Then a student named Mateo stayed after class. He was 9 and rarely spoke. His father had died the previous year, and his mother hoped art might help him express what he kept hidden. He placed a painting on my desk. 2 figures stood on opposite sides of a river. Above them was a bright red bridge. "What is this?" I asked. He pointed to the smaller figure. "That is me." "And the other?" "My dad." "What is the bridge?" He shrugged. "I don't know yet." Then he handed me a brush. "You can help." We sat together for nearly an hour, adding light to the water. After he left, I returned to the unfinished painting of the woman carrying the bowl of light. I mixed pale gold. My first brushstroke trembled. The second did not. Over the following months, I painted nearly every day. The work was not cheerful. It contained empty chairs, open doors, unfinished houses, and women standing at the edge of celebrations. But it was honest. Mary encouraged me to submit several pieces to a regional art fair. I am not ready. No artist has ever been ready. They simply run out of excuses. I submitted 3 paintings. One was accepted. The fair took place almost 9 months after my canceled wedding. By then, my art classes had grown enough to cover basic expenses. I had paid the last wedding bill and stopped searching online for news about Chris. The accepted painting was called "The Room After Everyone Leaves." It showed an empty dining room beneath a chandelier. At the far end, an open window revealed a garden flooded with color. My booth stood between a ceramic artist and a man who made sculptures from farm equipment. Most visitors glanced politely and continued walking. In the afternoon, a tall man wearing a simple gray jacket stopped in front of my painting. He remained there for several minutes. Finally, he turned toward me. "Who opened the window?" I frowned. "What?" "In the painting. Everyone has left, but someone opened the window. I suppose the woman who lives there. Did she leave too?" "No." "Why not?" I looked at the canvas. "Because the house still belongs to her." He smiled slightly. "That is a better answer than the one in the catalog." "You read the catalog?" "I read the things people hope no one notices." He introduced himself as Damien. Only Damien. We spoke for nearly half an hour about the painting, community art, and whether beauty needed to be comfortable. He did not ask whether my work was profitable. He did not suggest painting brighter flowers. He asked what the piece meant before telling me what it meant to him. He purchased it. Before leaving, he handed me a cream-colored business card. His name appeared in small black letters, but a strip of dark tape covered the title beneath it. I raised an eyebrow. "Is your occupation classified?" The cards were printed for a conference. The title creates conversations I do not always want. That sounds suspicious. It is mostly inconvenient. He wrote a delivery address on the back. It belonged to the Cole Art Foundation. You work for the foundation? In a manner of speaking. What manner? The inconvenient one. He walked away. That evening, while Mary drove home, I turned the card over in my hand. The tape covered a single line. I could have removed it. I did not. For the first time in years, I had met someone whose mystery did not make me feel unsafe. I did not yet know that the truth hidden beneath that tape would become the first great reversal of my life. Damien returned to the studio 2 weeks later. He arrived in an old blue pickup truck with "The room after everyone leaves" secured in the back. I thought you bought that, I said. I did. Buyers generally take paintings away. I need help deciding where it belongs. You work for an art foundation and cannot place a painting? I can place it. I cannot decide which room deserves it. He had recently restored a farmhouse outside Davis, where the foundation hosted visiting artists. We spent an afternoon moving the painting between a library, a hallway, and a small room overlooking a field. Eventually, we hung it opposite a real window. Now the window continues beyond the canvas, he said. That is either thoughtful or unbearably pretentious. I have been accused of both. Our friendship developed slowly. Damien attended several classes, usually standing quietly near the back. He remembered the children's names. He asked Matteo about the Red Bridge. He repaired a broken shelf without telling anyone. He also disappeared for days without explanation. Calls interrupted meals. Gallery directors returned his messages immediately. Once, at a cafe, a man in a tailored suit approached our table and addressed him as Mr. Cole, with the controlled politeness people use around someone powerful. Damien ended the conversation quickly. You could remove the tape from your card and save everyone the confusion, I said. And ruin our longest-running joke? I did not press him. Around that time, the studio began receiving more referrals from counselors and schools. We needed additional tables, accessible entrances, storage, and roof repairs. A spring storm exposed a leak above the supply room. Water damaged paper, warped part of the floor, and ruined several children's unfinished projects. The repairs cost more than Mary and I could afford. I applied for a community grant through the Cole Art Foundation. Before submitting it, I told Damien, I am applying to your foundation. That seems reasonable. I do not want you involved. I will recuse myself from anything related to the application. You are actually on the committee? In a manner of speaking, that answer is becoming annoying. It has always been annoying. Weeks passed. I prepared to reduce the number of classes. Then an envelope arrived. The grant had been approved. It covered the roof repairs, new equipment, an accessible entrance, scholarships for students, and a modest teaching salary for an entire year. I called Damien. Did you arrange this? No. You answered too quickly. I recused myself before the application was distributed. Who approved it? The grants committee. A committee suddenly discovered a small studio in a vineyard? The reviewers scored your proposal. You expect me to believe your name had nothing to do with it? I expect you to believe your work can succeed without being attached to me. The words silenced me. Several days later, a silver-haired woman arrived during class. She wore a navy coat, pearl earrings, and shoes entirely unsuitable for mud. She watched the children paint for almost an hour. When class ended, she introduced herself. I am Eleanor Cole, Damien's grandmother. I reviewed your application, she said. You sit on the committee? I chair it. Heat rose into my face. I hope the grant was not approved because of Damien. My grandson asked me not to read your application. That is not reassuring. He wanted to avoid influencing me. I read it because 3 independent reviewers ranked it first. She studied Matteo's painting. Damien told me months ago that an artist had reminded him why foundations should serve people rather than reputations. He told you about my work? Not your name. Eleanor faced me. I wanted to meet the woman who managed to influence him without knowing what his name was worth. I know his name. You do not know how much. Before I could ask what she meant, a black sedan entered the driveway. Damien stepped out, saw his grandmother through the window, and stopped walking. Eleanor smiled. He dislikes surprises. Is that why you came? No. I came because we are considering your program for a national arts partnership. My pulse quickened. What kind of partnership? Community studios, public schools, hospitals, and youth shelters. There will eventually be a national broadcast to raise funding. I am not someone who belongs on television. People who believe they belong on television are rarely the people who should be there. Damien entered. Grandmother, you took too long. You could have called. And missed that expression? She collected her handbag and left us alone. I looked at Damien. What is beneath the tape? He exhaled. Then he removed the business card from his wallet and peeled away the dark strip. The title read, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Cole Meridian Holdings. I stared. You run Cole Meridian? Yes. The company with hospitals, media studios, transportation divisions, hotels, and investment funds? Yes. The company valued at more than $12 billion? Approximately. I laughed once because the alternative was shouting. You allowed me to believe you were an employee of an art foundation. I am an employee. You are its chairman, an unpaid one. That is not better. He placed the card on the table. At the fair, I wanted to look at art without anyone calculating what I could buy, fund, or introduce them to. So you hid? Yes. Your grandmother said I did not understand what your name was worth. He looked uncomfortable. My personal holdings are publicly estimated above $5 billion. I sat down. You are a billionaire. Yes. And you drive that truck? It is reliable. I covered my face with both hands. This is absurd. I know. Why did you not tell me earlier? At first, because I wanted one conversation that did not change after someone searched my name. Later, because I was afraid honesty would change what we had. So you were testing me. At first, perhaps. And now? Now I am trying not to lose a friendship I value, because I was afraid of being used. I lowered my hands. Do you understand that hiding the truth is also a form of control? His face changed. Yes, that answer mattered. He did not defend himself. He did not claim good intentions. Erased the impact. He simply accepted what I said. Did you influence the grant? No. I submitted my recusal before your application entered review. Eleanor would show you the records if you asked. Why? Because I wanted your work to succeed only if people who knew nothing about us believed it deserved to. I needed time. Damien nodded. Unlike Chris, he did not ask how much. He left the studio without trying to purchase forgiveness. For nearly 2 weeks, we did not speak. Then an email arrived from Chris. The subject read, You deserve the complete truth. I considered deleting it. Instead, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the school district office. He looked older, though only a little more than a year had passed. His shoulders curved inward. The confidence the new position had once given him was gone. I am not asking you to forgive me, he said. Good. He placed his phone on the table. Your sister called me before I ended the engagement. I know my family pressured you. You do not know everything. He played an audio recording. Samantha's voice filled the space between us. She began pleasantly, telling Chris that marrying me would damage his career and create endless conflict. Then she reminded him that our father knew district trustees. She suggested that complaints from influential parents could affect his future if he made an immature decision. Finally, she said the curriculum position would become much easier to secure after the wedding was postponed. My hands became cold. You recorded her. I was frightened. Why didn't you tell me? I was ashamed that it worked. What happened to the position? The district investigated how I was selected. I returned to the classroom. Why give me this now? Because Samantha is applying for a communications role at a statewide education charity. I thought you should have evidence before she enters another place where she can threaten people. He transferred the recording to my phone. I did love you, he said. I believed him. That was the tragedy. Love without courage becomes another form of abandonment, I replied. I left. That night, I listened to the recording once more inside Mary's studio. For years, my family had rewritten every injury until I questioned whether I remembered it correctly. The recording could not be interrupted or shamed into changing its story. It simply existed. I saved several copies. I did not release it. I did not need revenge. I needed the truth to remain somewhere my family could not erase it. The following afternoon, I drove to Damien's farmhouse. My painting still hung opposite the window. He opened the door and looked surprised. "I am still angry," I said. "That is fair. But I understand why you were afraid." He waited. "I also understand that you told me before someone else could use the truth against me. I should have told you earlier." "Yes." He nodded. I looked at the painting. For months, I had believed it was about surviving abandonment. Now I saw something else. The open window was not only an exit, it was an entrance. "I would like to remain your friend," I said. His expression softened. "I would like that too." Neither of us knew my family had already discovered his identity. And Samantha had begun telling herself that the only reason Damien noticed me was because she had not been available first. The first message came from my mother. "Why didn't you tell us you knew Damien Cole?" The next came from Samantha. "Call me. This is important." I ignored both. By evening, cousins who had not contacted me since my cancelled wedding began sending cheerful messages. Someone had photographed Damien leaving the vineyard. A local business journal identified him, and within hours my family had created a version of the story in which I had deliberately hidden a valuable connection. My mother called repeatedly until I answered. "You have been spending time with one of the wealthiest men in the country," she said, "and did not think your family should know." I did not know at first. "But you know now." "Yes." "How serious is the relationship?" "We are friends." Samantha spoke in the background. "Ask if he remembers me." I almost laughed. Why would Damien remember Samantha? My mother lowered her voice. "They met at a charity luncheon several years ago." Samantha took the phone. "He asked whether I would attend a donor dinner." "That sounds like work." He was interested. "Did you attend?" "I was with Charles." "Then why does it matter?" "Because it proves Damien and I moved in the same circles before you wandered into an art fair." There it was. The mathematics of our family. If something valuable reached me, Samantha believed it must have passed her first. Damien is not a handbag you left behind. You become vulgar when you are threatened. I am not threatened. You should be realistic. Men like Damien date actresses, executives, and women from families like ours. They do not marry art teachers living with their aunts. We are not discussing marriage. Of course not. You are a temporary curiosity. I ended the call. The following morning, a reporter appeared near the vineyard gate. Then another. The first articles were harmless. Wealthy executive seen visiting local artist. But anonymous comments soon described me as emotionally unstable and estranged from a loving family. One source claimed I pursued Damien after applying for foundation money. Another suggested my grant had been exchanged for a romantic relationship. Samantha worked in public relations. She knew how to create a story without placing her fingerprints directly on it. The foundation released the independent review dates and Damien's formal recusal. The evidence cleared the grant, but facts rarely travel as quickly as gossip. Parents noticed reporters near the gate. One asked whether the studio was safe. A donor questioned whether the foundation had properly screened me. I called Damien. "I think we need distance." Because of the articles? Because every student who enters the studio is being photographed. I can arrange security. I do not want security around children carrying paint boxes. I want my work to exist without your name swallowing it. He was silent. I understand. He did not argue. That made the decision harder. For nearly 2 months, we had no personal contact. I focused on rebuilding the studio. The roof was repaired. We widened the entrance, installed accessible sinks, added work tables, and created scholarships for children whose families could not afford classes. Enrollment increased. I began offering evening sessions for adults recovering from grief, divorce, and illness. Mary called it a room for people who are tired of pretending they are fine. One afternoon, Eleanor found me sorting donated brushes. "My grandson is miserable," she said. "That sounds like private information." He is 38 years old. At my age, his privacy has become negotiable. I smiled despite myself. I did not step away to punish him. I know. I needed to know whether my work mattered without his protection. And? It does. Then perhaps you have answered the question. She handed me a folder. Inside was an invitation to present at the Foundation's annual gala. The event would launch the national initiative called Art Belongs Everywhere. My studio was one of 12 pilot programs, chosen from hundreds of applicants. They wanted me to perform a live painting during the fundraising broadcast. I cannot paint while an entire ballroom watches me. You stood beneath an empty wedding arbor after your family chose a yacht, Eleanor said. A ballroom is easier. I do not know what to paint. Yes, you do. The answer came from my students. During one class, Matteo asked why all the rooms in my paintings had doors. So someone can leave, I said. He considered that. Or come in. That became the idea. I designed a large canvas divided into separate dark rooms. During the gala, I would connect them with a river, made from the handprints of children in the program. The final image would become a house, without locked doors. A week before the gala, Damien arrived at the vineyard, carrying a paper bag of plumbing tools. Why are you here? Mary says the kitchen sink is leaking. From the house, Mary called. He is less expensive than a plumber. The billionaire is less expensive? He works for lunch. Damien repaired the sink. Afterward, we walked through the vineyard. I am sorry I disappeared, I said. You explained why. That does not mean it did not hurt. No. He looked across the rows of vines. I have spent most of my life surrounded by people who move closer when my name becomes useful. You moved away when staying might have benefited you. I did not want to. I know. We reached the lower field. A marker identified the reinforced landing area the documentary crew had created years earlier. Damien nudged it with his shoe. What lands here? Small emergency aircraft, apparently. No one has used it since the filming. He studied the open space. Useful. For what? I have no idea. You are still suspicious. I am trying to preserve some mystery. At the edge of the garden, he stopped. I do not want to continue pretending I only want friendship. My breath caught. What do you want? To take you to dinner. Somewhere without children, grant applications, family scandals, or broken plumbing. That sounds dangerously like a date. It is intended to. One date. One honest date. He kept that promise. Our relationship developed slowly. Damien never attempted to buy solutions to my discomfort. He introduced me to his world carefully, and he entered mine without expecting it to rearrange itself around him. He cleaned brushes after class. I attended meetings where people used phrases like strategic integration until I threatened to paint them on the walls. He told me his parents had died in a plane accident when he was young. Eleanor had raised him. Wealth protected him from many hardships, but not grief or the fear that affection could be purchased. I told him how often I had confused being needed with being loved. By the night of the gala, I trusted him. I did not yet trust the ballroom. The venue glittered beneath chandeliers. Paintings stood on illuminated panels. Donors, politicians, actors, doctors, and business leaders moved through the crowd. I wore a deep blue dress Mary helped me choose. Damien met me near the entrance. You look beautiful. You look inconveniently important. That is the dress code. Before he could guide me farther into the room, I heard Samantha's laugh. My parents and Samantha stood near the donor reception. Samantha wore silver. For one irrational moment, I was back at the yacht celebration, watching her occupy every place from which I had been excluded. Then she noticed Damien beside me. Her expression changed. She approached with the confidence she used when photographers were nearby. Damien Cole, she said. It has been years. Damien looked at her politely. Samantha Monroe, she continued. We met at the Harrington luncheon. He considered this. I remember the luncheon. You asked me to attend a donor dinner. I invited the entire communications committee. Her smile tightened. My mother stepped forward. Damien, we are Ellie's parent. I am aware. My father shook his hand. We hope she has not given you the wrong impression of the family. Damien's gaze remained calm. Ellie has been very careful not to give me any impression I could not verify. Samantha looked at me. You never told us you were performing. You never asked what I was doing. You rarely explain anything unless you want sympathy. The old accusation struck me, but it no longer entered as deeply. An announcement called guests toward the stage. Damien offered me his hand. Behind us, my mother whispered, "Do not embarrass yourself." The sentence had controlled me for most of my life. That night, it sounded small. I stepped onto the stage. The lights rose, and every camera in the ballroom turned toward me. The canvas towered above me. For several seconds, I heard nothing except my own breathing. Then, I saw Mateo in the front row beside Aunt Mary. He held up both thumbs. I dipped my brush into black paint. The first strokes formed walls. I worked quickly, building separate rooms across the canvas. Inside each one, I painted a small figure in a different color. A recorded narration began with statements collected anonymously from children in community art programs. I draw because words get stuck. I use yellow when I want tomorrow to come faster. I paint my mother because I miss her. The ballroom became silent. I broke openings through the painted walls. Assistants brought sheets containing my students' handprints. I pressed them into a river of color flowing across the canvas. As the final narration played, I painted a red bridge, Mateo's bridge. When I stepped back, the isolated rooms had become one wide house, filled with open doors. The audience rose. Not everyone immediately, but enough that the movement spread across the ballroom. Mary was crying. Damien stood beside her, watching me with an expression I had never seen before. Not pride in something he owned. Wonder. The auction began before I left the stage. A hospital network purchased the painting for enough money to fund several community studios. The broadcaster announced that the performance would appear in the opening episode of the national series. Backstage, my hands shook so badly I nearly spilled water over my dress. Damien entered. "You did it. I cannot feel my fingers. That may be paint." He took my hands and examined them. "You are supposed to say something romantic. I am checking whether you require medical attention." "That is extremely romantic." He kissed me. It was not our first kiss, but it was the first time I forgot there might be cameras nearby. When we returned to the ballroom, Samantha was waiting. "That was quite a performance," she said. "Thank you." It was not a compliment. "Then you should improve your delivery." Her eyes narrowed. "You think you belong here because Damien brought you. I was invited before we began dating. Because his grandmother felt sorry for you." Eleanor appeared beside us. I rarely confuse pity with investment. Samantha turned. Eleanor extended her hand. "I am Eleanor Cole, chair of the committee that selected Ellie's program." My mother hurried over. "There has been a misunderstanding." "No," Eleanor said. "I believe I understand the situation clearly." The host called Damien to the stage. The broadcaster introduced him as chairman of the Cole Art Foundation, chief executive of Cole Meridian Holdings, and one of the principal personal funders of the new national initiative. A short film showed studios, schools, shelters, and hospitals. My class appeared near the end. Then Damien spoke. He did not mention our relationship at first. He spoke about transparent grant review, public access, and investing in teachers who already understood the communities they served. Finally, he looked toward me. "Nearly a year ago, I purchased a painting from an artist who had opened a window inside an empty room. She reminded me that institutions often become obsessed with the room and forget the window." The audience turned. My mother's expression hardened. Ellie Monroe's studio will become one of the initiative's first permanent teacher training centers. Applause filled the ballroom. Samantha pushed through the crowd and disappeared into the corridor. My parents followed. I thought the evening had ended. The real conflict began the next morning. Entertainment sites published photographs of Damien and me, most focused on the art initiative. Then anonymous sources described me as an unstable daughter who had estranged herself from a loving family. Another article suggested I used Damien romantically to secure funding. Samantha's fingerprints were visible in the language, even when her name was not. Damien's communications team wanted to respond. I refused. I will not turn my childhood into a press conference. But the rumors began damaging the program. A donor asked whether the foundation had screened me. A parent called Mary. A partner organization delayed signing its agreement. That was when I remembered Chris's recording. I did not release it publicly. I delivered it to the Foundation's Independent Ethics Council, along with the grant records and messages showing my family's attempts to influence Chris. The council confirmed that Samantha's false statements could create legal exposure if she continued. They sent her a formal cease and desist notice. I expected her to retreat. Instead, she came to the vineyard. She stood outside the gate wearing sunglasses and a cream coat, pressing the intercom repeatedly. I walked down alone. "You sent lawyers after me," she said. "You spread false claims about a public program." I was protecting our family. From what? From becoming part of your performance. This is not about the family. Everything you do is about proving you are better than us. I studied her. Is that what you believe? You built your entire identity around being overlooked. I built a studio. With a billionaire. The grant was approved before we dated. You always have an answer. Because facts exist. Her jaw tightened. For a moment, I saw something beneath her anger. Not simply jealousy, but fear. When we were children, Samantha's position depended on remaining exceptional. My mother praised her beauty, discipline, and social instincts, but the praise was never unconditional. It came with a silent warning. Keep winning. Every time someone admired my painting, Samantha changed the subject. Every time Aunt Mary praised me, my mother reminded Samantha of another achievement. We had not been raised as sisters. We had been arranged as competitors, and Samantha had learned that losing attention meant losing love. That understanding explained her. It did not excuse her. "You took Daniel because he chose me first," I said quietly. Her face changed. That relationship was already failing. "You threatened Chris because he refused to cooperate. He was weak." "Yes, and you used that." She removed her sunglasses. "You always looked at me like I stole your life." "No, I looked at you like my sister." Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. "Damien would have noticed me if we met under different circumstances." "Perhaps." She seemed surprised. "But he did not choose me," I continued. "And he did not choose me because I defeated you. This is not a competition unless you keep making it one." Her hands tightened around the gate. "What do you want?" "I want you to stop lying. And if I don't?" "The recording remains evidence." "What recording?" I told her. The color disappeared from her face. "You would release it." "I have not." "You would destroy my career." "No. I am giving you the opportunity to stop damaging it yourself." She stepped away. Within a day, the anonymous stories disappeared. Samantha withdrew from consideration for the charity position. I thought the crisis had ended. Then a section of the recording appeared online. Chris had submitted it during the school district investigation. Someone connected to the case recognized Samantha's name in the gala coverage and leaked the audio. The clip spread quickly. People heard her imply that Chris's career depended on postponing our wedding. Charles ended their engagement. My father resigned from the fundraising board connected to the trustees. Clients began distancing themselves from Samantha's public relations firm. My mother called me. "You have to tell people this was a private misunderstanding." It was not. "Your sister's life is collapsing." She threatened someone's career. She believed she was protecting you from a bad marriage. No, she was protecting her position in the family. "After everything we did for you, what did you do for me?" Silence. She could have named my education, but Aunt Mary had paid for the opportunity that shaped me. She could have named my wedding, but they tried to erase it. She could have named support, but the recording made the claim impossible. Finally, she said, "We raised you. You housed me. Mary helped raise me." I ended the call. That evening, Damien found me cleaning brushes. "You do not seem pleased," he said. "I never wanted this story to become public. They can no longer control it. Truth is not always justice." "No," he said. "Sometimes it is only exposure." I looked at him. "What happens now? To them? To me?" He placed the brush in the jar. "You continue building the life you were building before anyone began watching." It sounded simple. It was not. But it was right. Nearly a year passed. The national initiative expanded. My studio began training teachers from across the state. Mary's old barn became a bright community center with wide windows, accessible workspaces, and walls filled with children's paintings. Public attention faded enough for life to become ordinary again. I was grateful. Damien and I built our relationship in the spaces between classes, travel, board meetings, and dinners at Mary's kitchen table. He never asked me to stop teaching. I never asked him to pretend his responsibilities were smaller than they were. On the anniversary of the gala, he brought me to the farmhouse, where the room after everyone leaves still hung opposite the window. "I need to ask you something," he said. "If it involves moving the painting again, the answer is no." He smiled and reached into his pocket. The ring was not enormous. It was a slender band with a blue sapphire between two small diamonds. For a moment, I could not breathe. "I spent years believing people stayed because of what I could provide," he said. "You were the first person who stepped away when staying could have benefited you. You returned only when you knew you could stand without me." He lowered himself to one knee. "Ellie Monroe, will you build a life with me in which neither of us has to become smaller?" I looked at the open window and the painting. Then at him. "Yes." Before he placed the ring on my finger, my phone rang. Aunt Mary sounded tense. "Your parents are here." They had not visited the vineyard in years. When we arrived, my mother stood in the garden, wearing heels that sank into the soil. My father waited near the porch. Samantha was not with them. My mother saw the ring immediately. "So it is true. What are you doing here?" "We came to speak privately." Damien went inside. My mother watched him leave. "He is respectful." "He is. You could have told us the relationship was serious." "We were not speaking. You stopped speaking to us. After you pressured Chris, supported Samantha, mocked my wedding, and allowed people to believe I was unstable." My father flinched. That situation became more complicated than anyone intended. It became exactly what Samantha intended. My mother clasped her hands. "We have made mistakes." It was the closest she had ever come to an apology. I waited. "But the public punishment has been excessive," she continued. "Samantha lost Charles. Your father lost his position. Friends stopped calling. We have suffered." There it was. Not sorrow for the harm. Sorrow for the consequences. I did not release the recording. "You could have defended us." "Against the truth?" Families protect each other. "Is that what you were doing when you excluded me from the yacht?" My father stepped forward. "We do not want to argue." "Then why are you here?" My mother looked toward the oak. "We heard you may marry here." "Yes." Her expression tightened. "Damien Cole is willing to have a backyard wedding? He likes the garden. But there will be important guests. They are capable of standing near grass." My father almost smiled. My mother did not. "We would like to attend." I had imagined those words for years. In some versions, I forgave them immediately. In others, I closed the door. Reality was quieter. "Why?" "Because you are our daughter." That was true at my first wedding. She looked away. "We were wrong." "About what?" "About the wedding." "And?" My father answered. "We should not have pressured Chris." "And?" "We should have handled Samantha's jealousy differently." "And?" Neither spoke. I looked at my mother. "Do you believe my work matters?" "Of course." "Would you believe it if Damien were not standing inside this house?" Her eyes filled. "You make everything a test." "No. I am asking whether you see me." She reached forward. I stepped back. "I want to," she whispered. It was not enough for trust. But it was more honest than anything she had said before. I told them I would send invitations with conditions. They were not to contact the press, vendors, guests, or broadcasters. They would not receive ceremonial roles. They could attend as ordinary guests if they responded by the deadline and followed security procedures. My mother looked offended. "We need conditions to attend our daughter's wedding?" "Yes." My father nodded. "We understand." Damien and I decided to hold the wedding beneath Mary's oak tree, just as I had once planned. The design remained simple in spirit, though the guest list included people from our work. Wildflowers, wooden chairs, painted lanterns, the original arbor. The public broadcaster asked to include part of the ceremony in the live finale of Art Belongs Everywhere. At first, I refused. I did not want our marriage turned into entertainment. Then, the producers explained that the broadcast would follow communities across the country and conclude at the vineyard, where donations would fund permanent art spaces. Mateo, now nearly 12, listened to the discussion. "People saw your empty wedding online," he said. "Maybe they should see the full one." We agreed on strict terms. The wedding would not be marketed as a billionaire fairy tale. The broadcast would focus on the programs, teachers, and children. Our vows would conclude the event as a statement about chosen family and open doors. The roads near the vineyard were narrow, and Damien was required to attend a federal arts funding meeting in Los Angeles on the morning of the ceremony. To ensure he arrived before the live broadcast, his transportation team arranged a helicopter. The reinforced lower field Mary had mentioned years earlier was inspected and approved. Every improbable detail had a practical reason. My family knew almost none of it. Several days after receiving the invitations, Samantha posted, "Some people turn weddings into publicity stunts when love alone is not interesting enough." My mother called Mary and described the broadcast as vulgar. My father emailed me, "We cannot endorse a ceremony designed to humiliate the family." I replied that the ceremony was not about them. They missed the response deadline. A week before the wedding, my mother mailed the invitation back. Across the front, she had written, "We will not participate in your revenge." Security finalized the guest list without their names. The night before the wedding, the garden glowed beneath test lights. Children hung painted panels along the barn. Camera crews checked cables without disturbing the flower beds. I stood beneath the oak wearing jeans and a sweater. Damien called from Los Angeles. "The meeting may run late, but the flight schedule has a buffer. If you miss the wedding, I am marrying the pilot. I will warn him." "Are you nervous?" "Yes." "About the broadcast?" "About the vows. You speak to thousands of shareholders. They cannot reject me at an altar." I already said yes. "You could discover better judgment overnight." "That seems unlikely." After the call, Mary joined me beneath the tree. "The first time you planned this wedding," she said, "you wanted to prove simple could be worthy. And now? Now you know it is worthy whether anyone approves or not." I leaned against her shoulder. "I wish they had chosen differently." "So do I." "Does that mean I have not healed?" "No. Healing does not erase the wish that people had loved you better. It stops that wish from controlling the life you build." The following afternoon, the vineyard filled with flowers, guests, music, and cameras. I dressed in Mary's bedroom. My gown was soft ivory, with hand-painted blue flowers along the skirt. I had designed every one. Inside one pocket, I carried the brass studio key. Inside the other, I carried the small blue stone from my first engagement ring. Chris had returned it with a note saying he no longer deserved to keep a symbol of courage he had failed to show. I did not carry it because I missed him. I carried it because I wanted to remember the woman who once believed being chosen was the same as being safe. Shortly before the ceremony, security called. A sedan had stopped outside the outer gate. My parents and Samantha were inside. "They are not on the list," the coordinator said. "They claim there has been a misunderstanding." Mary took my hand. "What do you want to do?" Before I answered, the sound of helicopter blades rolled across the vineyard. Guests looked toward the sky. The broadcast cameras turned. My phone began vibrating inside my pocket. The helicopter descended over the lower field. Wind swept through the vineyard, bending the flowers and lifting the edges of the aisle runner. Guests shielded their eyes as the aircraft settled onto the reinforced grass. Through Mary's bedroom window, I watched the door open. Damien stepped out in a dark suit. The broadcast monitor carried the announcer's voice. "Damien Cole has arrived from Los Angeles, where he addressed federal and private partners supporting national arts education. Cole is chairman and chief executive of Cole Meridian Holdings, with a personal fortune estimated above $5 billion, and a principal founder of Art Belongs Everywhere." Damien did not look toward the cameras. He looked toward the farmhouse. Toward me. Mary smiled. "Still planning to marry the pilot? I am keeping my options open." My phone continued vibrating. My father wrote, "We're outside the gate. Tell security to let us in." My mother followed. "This has gone far enough. Admit us before people notice." Then Samantha, You planned this to make us look cruel. The coordinator waited. Should security allow them inside? For most of my life, I had responded to my family before I understood what I wanted. Their anger created urgency. Their disappointment created guilt. Their silence made me chase them. I pictured my first wedding. The empty chairs. The unfinished arbor. Chris standing in the garden, already halfway gone. I pictured the returned invitation with my mother's handwriting across it. They had been offered a place. They rejected it because attending without control felt like humiliation. Now the ceremony was visible to the country, and they wanted entry. Not because they finally saw me, because millions of strangers might notice their absence. I typed a reply to my father. Too late. Much too late. Then I turned off my phone. Do not admit anyone who is not on the list, I told the coordinator. She nodded and left. Mary studied me. How do you feel? Sad. Anything else? Free. She kissed my forehead. The music began beneath the oak. I walked through the farmhouse and into the garden. The ceremony was everything I had drawn years earlier and more than I could have imagined. Wildflowers lined the path. Lanterns hung from the branches. Children from the studio sat beside teachers, artists, neighbors, donors, doctors, and families from programs across the country. The wooden chairs were full. Damien waited beneath the arbor. For a moment, I forgot the helicopter, cameras, and people watching from homes. I saw only him. When I reached the front, he took my hands. You came, I whispered. I considered making a dramatic entrance. Very subtle. The officiant welcomed the guests and acknowledged the viewers joining through the national broadcast. Before our vows, the producers played the final segment of the Arts Initiative. It began with images from community studios. Children painted hospital walls. Adults recovering from illness-shaped clay. Teachers opened art rooms inside rural schools and shelters. Then the screen showed Mary's old studio before the repairs. Water stains, broken shelves, narrow doors. The image dissolved into the new center, filled with light. The announcer revealed the final fundraising result. The broadcast had already raised enough to establish more than 40 permanent art spaces. But that was not the only announcement. Eleanor stepped onto the small platform. She explained that an independent board had selected me as the founding creative director of a national teacher training network. The position had been planned for months, but I had refused to accept it unless the board guaranteed that grant decisions would remain independent of Damien and me. A public trust had been created for that purpose. The network would not bear Damien's name. It would be called the Open Window Project. I had known the announcement was coming, but not the name. Eleanor had chosen it from my first painting. Applause rose through the garden. Outside the gate, my family watched on Samantha's phone. They had believed the helicopter was the surprise. They had believed my victory was marrying a wealthy man. The real reversal was that the work they had mocked now belonged to me in a way no husband, company, or family connection could grant or remove. Damien had not made me important. He had protected the space in which other people could recognize what had already existed. The ceremony continued. Damien spoke first. Ellie, when I met you, you had painted an empty room with an open window. I believed I was purchasing a picture of loneliness. You taught me it was a picture of choice. You never asked me to rescue you. You asked me to tell the truth. You never demanded that I abandon my world. You invited me to enter yours honestly. I promise never to confuse providing for you with deciding for you. I will stand beside your work, not in front of it. I will listen when your voice is quiet and respect it when it is strong. And when either of us begins closing windows because we are afraid, I will remind us that love is not a locked room. By the time he finished, tears blurred my vision. I unfolded my vows. Damien, before I met you, I believed being chosen by someone else would prove I had value. I built relationships like courtrooms, always presenting evidence that I deserved to stay. You did not teach me that I was worthy. Life, Mary, my students, and my work had already begun teaching me that. What you gave me was the safety to believe it without argument. I promise not to punish you for wounds you did not create. I promise not to disappear when honesty becomes uncomfortable. I will love the man, not the title, and remind you that neither success nor failure can measure the size of a life. And I promise our home will always have an open door for truth, even when it must remain closed to harm. The officiant pronounced us married. Damien kissed me beneath the oak as the lanterns moved above us. Later, during the reception, Matteo showed me the mural from the gala. He had added a tiny helicopter above the house. I thought it needed one, he said. It definitely did. Near sunset, the security coordinator approached. Your family has left. I nodded. They gave the guard this. She handed me a white envelope. Inside was a note from my father. We believed you needed us to validate your choices. Today I saw that you built a life while we were still deciding whether it deserved approval. I do not know how to repair what we did. I am beginning to understand that asking to enter is not the same as earning an invitation. There was no note from my mother. Samantha had written one sentence on the back. I do not know who I am when I am not competing with you. I folded the paper. Damien came beside me. You do not have to answer today. I know. That was another difference between love and control. Love allowed time. After the cameras left and the guests began departing, I changed out of my dress and walked alone to the studio. The room smelled of paint, old wood, and lavender. On the wall hung the painting. I began at 17, a woman carrying a bowl of light through a dark house. I had worked on it gradually over the past years. Several doors now stood open. A garden appeared beyond the far wall. Only the woman's face remained unfinished. I mixed a small amount of paint. I did not give her a triumphant smile. I gave her a peaceful one. When I stepped back, she no longer looked as though she were escaping. She looked as though she knew exactly where she was going. Outside, Damien called my name. I set down the brush. For once, I did not need to remain in the room after everyone left. I turned off the light and walked toward the life waiting beyond the door. The weeks after our wedding were louder than I expected. Clips of the helicopter landing spread across television and social media. Strangers discussed my dress, Damien's vows, the garden, and the message I sent my father. Many called it perfect revenge. I never did. Revenge would have meant building the wedding around my family's humiliation. We built it around art, community, and the promise Damien and I made to each other. Their absence was a consequence of their choices, not the purpose of the day. Samantha moved to another city after her public relations firm asked her to leave. For several months, I heard nothing from her. Then a letter arrived. She did not blame our mother, Charles, Chris, the media, or me. She wrote that she had spent most of her life believing love was a limited resource. Every time someone noticed my work, she felt something being taken from her. Every time I chose a path she did not understand, she interpreted it as criticism of her own life. She apologized for Daniel, Chris, the rumors, and the returned wedding invitation. I did not invite her back immediately. An apology can open a door. It does not erase everything that happened inside the room. We began with letters. My mother took longer. She continued describing the conflict as a misunderstanding until Aunt Mary told her that accountability could not begin while she kept changing the name of the harm. Nearly a year after the wedding, my father came to the studio alone. He asked permission before entering. He did not bring flowers or make a speech. He helped repair several easels and listened while I explained the program. Before leaving, he stopped beside the childhood painting of the blue horse. I remember this, he said. It was never in the hallway. No, but I remember. It was not forgiveness. It was one honest moment. That was enough for one afternoon. My mother eventually attended counseling with him. Our relationship remained distant and carefully bounded. I stopped measuring her progress by whether she became the mother I had wanted, and began measuring it by whether she respected the limits I set. Damien and I divided our time between the farmhouse and the vineyard. The open window project continued to grow, but I kept teaching. Public attention faded, as it always does. The children still arrived with paint on their sleeves and stories they could not say aloud. Aunt Mary continued criticizing every expensive chair Damien purchased. Mateo finished his bridge. Beneath the old oak, the wildflowers returned each spring without caring who once called them weeds. For years, I believed my greatest victory would be the moment my family regretted underestimating me. I was wrong. My greatest victory was becoming so certain of my own worth that their regret was no longer required. People may close doors, choose someone else, or leave you sitting before empty chairs. That pain is real, but it does not have to become your identity. Sometimes the life meant for you begins after the celebration you thought you needed falls apart. Sometimes the room becomes empty, so you can finally see the open window. And sometimes the wedding everyone called trashy becomes beautiful, not because a billionaire arrives by helicopter, not because cameras broadcast it across the country, and not because the people who rejected you are left outside. It becomes beautiful because, at last, you arrive as yourself.